Hello everyone, today we make an episode that is probably going to take multiple videos to finish, which is a macroscopic overview of Roman warfare between the 2nd century BC to roughly the age of Justinian. You probably wonder why do you make this kind of videos, especially considering that I often, in fact, go in far depth into sort of also relatively, at least secondary, I don't like the term obscure topics. Whatever we cover, I always have the impression that is sort of too important to be even covered in a single or more videos, and that it deserves, in fact, much deeper attention. You call that niche normal. I can make actual niche content as well, as especially the most affectionate of you really know. However, this is exactly the point. Sometimes, and I made this point many times itself in the past, because I have videos of this genre as well, it's only through these massive overviews that you can blend together all the more dispersed content, right? If you are curious also just to have a synthesis, a critical overview to see how I navigate the topic and what kind of sort of insight we should get from it overall. This is a good exercise for everyone involved, because obviously it requires a bit of, not of abstraction, actually even more concrete eye, so to say, but some theoretical framework that other videos wouldn't otherwise have. And from your side, of course, like there may be a challenge, like if you've never really focused on certain aspects of the wall, conceptualized them, etc. It may sound challenging and new and whatever, but this is the reason also why Schwerpunkt is here to begin with. And it's obvious that I don't know again how long this is going to take before starting, but this is still going to constitute a pretty unsatisfactory overview of the wall, right? Meaning that even though, again, there is this macroscopic scale of browsing inside, this is not meant to be a definitive observation of the entire picture, right? It's rather some orientative scoping exercise that can turn out to be useful in many other ways. Talking about the Roman army is obviously a challenge in a time which you have often just being presented the broader picture in many circumstances. There are some Roman history scholars that have at some point recently turned to YouTube. I was a kid when I used to read Goldsworthy's books on the Roman army. And now I listen to him and say, well, okay, maybe here I could add a pair of other perspectives. This is the beauty of sort of historians' dialectical comparison. There are so many different ways of looking at this, and it also shows really how, in fact, naive all those perspectives on, like, we need to, pinpoint this view and find a citation for this. History does not work like that. Like, it works like that in your early 20s, right, up to mid 20s. After that, you're supposed to have already gone beyond, to have been able to build like enough knowledge and insight and criticism, analytical skills to form, in fact, definitely also an informed, adequately informed opinion of the wall that can contribute to the debate, while still being, in fact, quite grounded on actual evidence. Because this is the problem. Like, most people don't know that most specialists in any field, or also more, the authorities in the field, do not agree with one another. Right? There isn't a superimposable picture that simply derives from the fact that these people are experts or otherwise are bad or have some sort of bias that fundamentally undermines what we understand as a academic standard, as a scientific rigor. On the contrary, most people fly lower and do not really get how it is above. And it is actually more beautiful, but also more challenging than it seems, really. And so we can all find different ways sometimes to the same topic. I wasn't sure, in fact, even what to start from this. I think a year ago or so I made a video about the sources on the Roman army, probably the classical literature, the primary sources that you should read in order to get acquainted with it. I also made more, even more distantly, a video about, in fact, how to properly approach, in a broader conceptual sense, the Roman army. So you understand how we get step by step always deeper, even in these presentations. And I think a good way to start is a reference to sources and specifically to manuals, right? Roman military manuals, and 6 of them have survived from the relevant historical period we're covering today. Naturally, they all come, I think, by this point with English translations. It's good, obviously, to be able to read Hellenic and Latin, to say the least, for not even just for studying ancient history, but in any case, right? We will briefly browse these. We have Onasander, a Platonic philosopher rather than a professional soldier. This is typical of the Hellenistic sort of context in which much of these manuals were properly written, because the Romans didn't have a model on their own. They had something that, in any case, they had developed imitating by genre from the Greeks, because Romans do not sit down and write about that. Naturally, also these were also in the Hellenistic world normally dictated to scribes, to specialized slaves. And Onasander wrote his treatise Strategikos, also known as thus sort of the commander, the general, in the early 1st century AD, around 49 to 57, 58. And we know this because he dedicated it to Quintus Veranius. Quintus Veranius Nepos was the consul of 49 AD, who later served as legate in Britain. Still have to finish a series on Roman Britain for that matter, and died there around, in fact, 57, 58, providing a firm terminus ante quem for the work's composition. And Onasander explicitly addressed the treatise to Romans of senatorial dignity raised to consular or general rank through the wisdom of Augustus Caesar. Right. It focused on the ethical qualities, background, and conduct expected of an ideal Roman general, emphasizing psychological insights and leadership principles that influenced later Byzantine military thought. This is for telling you, even in fact, as a broader horizon, what these manuals were about, right? You know that I discussed Renaissance manuals a lot, and we pointed out how the early modern thinkers, not even commanders, because these manuals circulated much less in the hands of those who actually waged war than we normally think, right? There was no such a thing like a military revolution in the Renaissance, let alone driven by some sort of loose adaptation of certain classical era military concepts or formations, whatever, compared to the already more advanced, in fact, art of war of that point. Onasander, again, was not a soldier himself, but as we know also from other sort of Hellenistic authors at some point, you don't really need to be, in order to talk warfare, also at an informed level. And he really, and Clausewitzianly speaking, stressed moral forces, right? What kind of standards, like what kind of rigor, discipline, what virtues at the end of the day were necessary in order to rise to probably the higher level that had been, in fact, set by Augustus as the medium of God, and therefore sanctioning a golden age as far as his commanders were also concerned, right? So picked from the elite itself, but for a specific military inclination and reputation. Consider how, in this sense, like the treatises we list now are somehow sort of even less notorious, I would say, in today's pop culture online, etc., than the later Byzantine era manuals, or at least the Strategikon that we will mention here too, and that, however, do not instead take in consideration that the actual tradition, which especially Byzantine, in fact, classicistic literature was drawing from, had been sedimented from quite a while. This is not sort of stripping the Byzantines of their, in particular, like Hellenically characteristic intellectual genius, right? And the capacity to systematize, to observe, like the beauty of the Strategikons, we will repeat now because we discussed it on many occasions, is properly blending that Roman practicality and also in part sort of clarity, straightforwardness with this great intellectual sophistication and capacity, in fact, of observation. But there is, in fact, a world from which this genre is coming from that is to be counted, in fact, across the centuries as one of great secularization of thought, but also providing with a standard, with a sort of what should we actually discuss and why. Consider that there were lots of other treatises, right? The same Augustus actually wrote one about tactics. So unfortunately, that did not survive to our era. But this is for saying how at some point we could even make a video about this, like why were these treatises written to begin with? And they were obviously inspirational. They were always obviously speaking to people who already knew how to make war because they got into it by career, by status. Already was considered, like in Romanity, like a duty to have served in the military and before accessing civil politics, so to say, even though sort of the higher magistracies obviously entailed a part of imperium as well. And so the obvious that is unfortunately also shown by the absence of evidence regarding, for example, I don't know, what did a centurion actually know? Like, we don't have manuals written by centurions. We can't think that even at some point somebody wrote something. But it wasn't important for properly the intellective and cultural horizons of the era to know what essentially the top NCO or the lower officers rank would actually think in something that had to be remembered, ideally, in the affirmation of a perfect divine power that in and of itself at the higher level of command already owned all the wisdom and insight that was necessary. And you understand through this how functional these manuals really were for, in fact, a moral dimension that is the most important in warfare as opposed to the technical one. Right? Instead, properly, as the Romans would have said, adminus, from which, in fact, the same term administration comes from, was left to the lower echelons that do not see relief from the top. Other important author, Frontinus, right, authoring a tactical manual later in the same first century that has since been lost, but producing a companion work called, in fact, the Stratagems, the Strategemata, which survives and offers an exceptional collection of deceptive military tricks drawn from Hellenic and Roman history intended to surprise and outmaneuver an unsuspecting foe. Composed after AD 84 during the reign of Domitian, whom Frontinus served as a general in Germania, where he participated, in fact, in campaigns against the Catti in the early 80s as legate of the army of Lower Germany, Germania Inferior. It covered topics like discipline, concealment of plans, and psychological factors in warfare, with references to Domitian as Germanicus, reflecting, in fact, the events of his own service, including, in fact, an example where the same emperor ordered dismounted cavalry to fight on foot against the Catti, who repeatedly fled into forests, interfering with mounted engagements. This is quite interesting because for two reasons. Indeed, these tactics were absolutely performed, and the fact that the Germans at large did not really meet the Roman legions in open field because they were perfectly aware of the symmetry there, but in fact harass them, and in this sense deprive them also of the maneuverability and sort of cavalry shock effect in certain circumstances. Happened, I don't know, even with the Irish against the English in the High Middle Ages, this kind of things, but could not, in this sense, also stop dismounted cavalrymen from attacking, in fact, on foot. And this we covered also in other videos that highlight how sort of, in fact, non-technical, again, the hierarchy of powers really is. Like how if you have a moral force that is capable of chasing an enemy into the forest, ideally, like you don't send your best cavalrymen to do that, right? But there were lots of auxiliaries as well, and in certain circumstances, you know that the same Roman legionnaires were, although not particularly conceived for mounted combat, could definitely engage in that too, aside from obviously the turmi that were present in the legions proper. They were just a token, like a symbolic force, so to say. There was a proclivity to adaptation that we tend not to think very much when you think about legionary infantry, in fact, but that could really do something different. It's obvious that you don't send the highly trained Roman legionnaire to perform tasks highly attritional guerrilla warfare, where in fact also lighter, more lightly equipped forces can fight, but they would occasionally find themselves in the condition of doing so. But the other aspect that aligns with what we were saying before that is interesting about the Strategimata is the fact that also in here we shouldn't get this sort of a nominalistic heretic idea that, you know, the Romans or any other people knew a set of tricks that nobody else knew, right? Knowing of them for the, in fact, educated elite that was the same one that went to war, etc., was a way to sort of inform it better, to provide them with this broader set of sort of anecdotes that would ideally provide you like with sort of a given solution to depending on the circumstances. But always remember that it's not until the 18th century, the same von Clausewitz really, that military manuals are actually conceived to be positively expandable in a truly practical sense regarding probably the overall theory that they're able to provide to you, provided, by the way, as the same von Clausewitz says, that still direct military experience, naturally in positions of command, is preferable for mastering that at a high level. So given that here we're talking the same heights, so to say, of command, we have to understand also how much more directly imbued probably with military knowledge and experience. Think about even just the tales of your father, of your ancestor, this continuous presence, let's say, of the various Roman nobiliary clans in all over the world, really across 3 continents, that would alone confer them this immediate practical command of the situation. Having slaves is also basically what offered to kids, even just how probably to be humanly capable of commanding people. This is an incredibly important aspect in this upbringing as well. So you read the Strategimata today and you say, oh, wow, look, you know, here this historian told us that in this battle, this thing happened. So look, here it's written in the manual as well. It didn't really matter to them, right? They could have found it curious in the way how certain things kind of overlap, but this is more like notionistics, right? Also, when you read Sun Tzu, you wouldn't believe someone would tell you, never besiege a city. Right? Otherwise, war could have not been waged to begin with. You have, if anything, to understand behind these anecdotes, and so not at all the systematic military wisdom that was, in this sense, theoretically provided, only starting from the 19th century. And it's not, again, a compliment to the 19th century per se, if not under that specific intellectual point of view, right? Why also? Because in this sense, people were much more detached, commanders probably were much more detached from warfare later on, and were also commanding, admittedly at that point, something bigger by the Napoleonic era. In this day and age, in fact, manuals. It is until the Renaissance where they start having some minimal relevance, especially in the early period. Right, the manuals were not even needed, if not as a divertissement, as a way of saying, ideally, let's conceptualize this, but then when it gets to actual fighting, it depends obviously on the situation. There are other qualities that come into place. Frontinus is, again, interesting because he had actual military experience. Then you have Arian, Flavius Arrianus. This was an Hellenic historian and Roman governor of Cappadocia under Hadrian, so roughly 131, 137. Look at this provincial government. His tactics, the Ars Tactica, essentially paraphrases the earlier Hellenistic writer Scipio Aemilianus. This is also a way to go that starts, in fact, sounding a bit Byzantine in nature. So, copying, if you look at the Leo the Wise's Tactica, it's notoriously just the Strategikon rewritten with a minimal last phrase at the end of the paragraph. If he was in the mood to insert it, to add the minimal change in flavor, but that was supposed to be adapted to a broader sort of context that, especially in Byzantine mentality, was to simply insist within itself. And in the Greeks had originated this kind of thinking, that this older Dorian orders, this is even before Roman times, had to be preserved to the point of crystallization, that if you simply paraphrase another author's work, and everybody knew that, by the way, because Scipio Aemilianus was one of sort of the most important authors back in the day, it would be kind of okay. There is in Arian, however, also the incorporation of Adrianic reforms, the enhancing, for example, like the work with a useful section, Roman cavalry training and battlefield techniques as well. And then you have, most famously, the order of battle against the Alans, that I think I made an entire video on, the Ectaxis Kata Alanon, or Acies contra Alanos, written around 135. Detailing marching columns through enemy territory, along with the formations adopted specifically to counter shock cavalry from the Alans. I also made multiple videos about them and their warfare. This was a Sarmatian nomadic people who threatened, in fact, Roman Cappadocia after having been summoned by the Iberian king Pharasmanes II, leading, in fact, to this incursion into Transcaucasia and up to Cappadocia in 135. And yes, I talk, I think, about Arian in that list of... there's no standalone video. Excuse me, I check 1 second if I... Yeah, it's the one on the sources on the Roman Arian. So we already briefly commented on that at some point. We'll surely make a standalone video because you know what this is about. It's the description of a defensive phalanx-like infantry array supported by missile troops and auxiliary units from, in fact, Cappadocia to repel this Alan heavy cavalry charges, drawing surely directly from Arian's own experience commanding forces in that campaign, where he gathered around 18,000 soldiers, though the nomads, in fact, ultimately retreated without a major engagement, which was somehow also in their style, together with this Iranics in general. We'll come back on this kind of warfare because we stopped talking a bit about ancient warfare lately. However, we browsed also the actual content of the kata, and we observed that the description of this array is fundamentally just more like an illustration of some specific units. Their commanders, they're all taken sort of in consideration, called by name. And there is not really much of a technical explanation of how this array would have had to work, right? There are indications obviously on the location, the sizes of the troop, and all this stuff, but it's more like an illustration of how composite this force really was and how they were all mutually interdependent on one another. We don't actually understand from the work how this array against the Alans should have practically worked, also because we don't really know for the entire history of the Roman army exactly how much space actually these formations occupied, etc. People sort of break their heads on these numbers that are, if they actually had any clue about what primary sources say and or what's their context to begin with, they would know that there's no way to know, right? There are very few figures properly in all the arc of Roman warfare that tell us sometimes also quite opposite things, right? If you listen to Polybius and then Vegetius, you would have regarding the Roman order of battle for having infantry respectively, like an open order and a phalanx-like formation. And obviously things change. No army is equal to another one and so on. And there isn't a rigid kind of, look, here I see a pattern, so I will fantasize or speculate about this, and I will tell you how the Roman army was actually arrayed. Nobody knows. This is notorious. Like if you are worth 2 cents as a historian, you know that this is the basis of it all, and then only on top of this we can build other considerations for understanding other, actually also more important aspects of warfare than how sort of large a formation was, of how deep the ranks were, all this kind of stuff. And in fact, when you read Arian regarding to this array to counter the Alans, it's understood that there is some kind of mutual support, combined arm tactics, whatever, but how this array against the Alans would have worked, or whether this was meant properly to defeat the Alans or in this expedition, or the Alans in general, etc. It's not said, and it's not important. And in fact, we shouldn't even probably take that too seriously after all. All right. Now, passing to Vegetius, he composed his manual, the Epitome Rei Militaris, also known as, more simply, the Re Militari, during the late 4th or early 5th century. This is for telling you, by the way, how scarce these manuals are altogether. Like we passed from the 1st to 2nd century to the 4th, the 5th, and Vegetius is indeed incredibly important. If anything, it was the only of these military manuals that were studied in the West during the Middle Ages. So some historians would like to make him, also in this case, a bit more influential than he actually was. I know very specific scholars that wrote works like saying, look, this medieval battle in the early 14th century by the Palaiologus that had read Vegetius here aligns with one thing that is said in the manual, like a most banal thing, like, I don't know, having sort of wings, some certain troops placed here and there, like, can always happen in very simple ways. By the way, it's not abstruse combination of troops or alchemic, kabbalistic proportions of forces that no source describes, nor in antiquity, nor in the Middle Ages, nor ever, because it doesn't matter really that much for how a combat is fought or lost, and these are just sort of modernistic alienations from reality as usual, right? But regarding Vegetius, that I'm not, by the way, trying to minimize the importance of these works. They are incredibly important. They're incredibly striking. What I lament is how they're often misinterpreted or mistaken properly by moderns in ways that, in fact, we already know. Historiographically, we can't properly do. Regarding Vegetius's works dating, we have internal evidence pointing to the reign of Valentinian III, or possibly even Theodosius I, ruling out Valentinian I. Vegetius's text mixes contemporary practices with older methods in a somewhat confused manner, requiring readers to exercise great caution, yet it retains considerable value as a reform-minded compilation advocating revival of traditional legionary discipline in training amid growing barbarian influences. Some manuscripts link revisions or dedications to figures associated with the early 5th century, reflecting concerns over federated alliance and naval matters in Western Mediterranean around the 430s to 40s, with a reference to the deified Gratian, placing therefore the composition after 383, and possible allusions to events up to 450, even, at least in certain manuscript traditions, because obviously we got all this from the Middle Ages as well. And in this sense, Vegetius is an incredibly fascinating read because he's reflecting a bit beyond the mere technicalities of warfare. At least he's framing them in an ideal of the Roman military that he thought, in fact, he passed down even as a sort of complaint. This happens in moments of crisis. People discourage themselves about the current situations rather than looking at still what actually works. And so you have this strange melange of information about the Roman army. By the way, Vegetius is somehow aware and open about the relative incoherence of, at least he opens the work famously by claiming that he does not have a military experience or capacity, in particular on his own. So he's obviously describing the ideal model of an army that he located at the time, say, of Caesar, of Augustus, and that he did not see in his present times because he was witnessing to the decline of the empire, especially in the West, and in general, probably the ways of war that had made the Romans great to conquer the world, and now fading away, right? So it's actually, however, very rich and deep in probably in descriptions and visions. So there are very interesting and also technical data that are definitely expandable. When reenactors say, yeah, but we tested the plumbate, they tell us something different in range compared to what the authors at the time. Does it even matter? You see, this is where I want to throw this provocation fundamentally by saying, like, but do we really think, I don't know, that how long the plumbate range really was at the time, aside from the hubris of pretending that you would know better how to build one, to toy with one without properly a late Roman military, properly combat context. Do you think that there is any, and this, my criticism is extended also to other periods of Reconstructionism, the Middle Ages and so on, that this has any actual historical relevance in explaining how major political, strategical, and tactical circumstances could be narrated, could be explained today, right? It's something, frankly, a bit disturbing. Finally, as we were saying before, we have the Mauritius, or pseudo Maurice's Strategikon, an early Byzantine work from the late 6th century, attributed, in fact, to the milieu, at least the court of Emperor Maurice, who ruled between 582 and 602, providing many insights into earlier Roman organization and tactics, including drill movements executed to Latin commands still at the time. It's only in the following generation, fundamentally, the Byzantine army and empire in general would undergo some further final Hellenization, certain terminology, etc. Because in the Roman army in particular, like up to that point, Latin had been the official language. And the work notoriously covers cavalry formations, ambushes, baggage trains, surprise attacks, sieges, and the characteristics of various enemy peoples. That, as we also dedicated multiple videos to, in fact, already, with practical emphasis on flexible combined arms tactics against foes like the Avars, who had established, as you know, this powerful presence in the Pannonian plain after the mid-560s. Persians, Slavs, and others, while showing familiarity with Hellenistic models like Onasander and Aelian, as a matter of fact. And Maurice himself had commanded successfully against the Persians before his accession, and later led campaigns pushing back Avar and Slavic advances across the Danube. This is incredibly important, not just because it sets properly the standards for Byzantine military treatise. It's blended inseparably with passages from Leo's treatise in the following centuries. However, it's properly the peak again of the fantastic effervescence and alchemy of Roman and Greek military thinking, adapted, in fact, to this era, essentially Justinianean one of Maurice later in the late 6th, early 7th century. And it's a fantastic work. It's actually the most interesting of these texts. However, as we've seen in the videos about, in fact, 6th century Byzantine army training and all this stuff that mostly are based, in fact, on what the Strategikon says, there is a pinch of, again, Greek idealism and sort of categorism, and much of what is described obviously fits some general military practice. We can assume there are lots of tactical modules that explain exactly how this or that unit should be located, how they should interact with one another. And this surely derives from some level of properly theoretical recruitment training that was given to this or that unit, and tactical sort of expendability of the same from the side of the commanders. In any case, it is somehow still anecdotal, right? And actually the most important part, in fact, is the one that describes the military costumes of all the various barbarians, of all the various enemies of the empire. That is, I would say, actually incredibly spot on, right? If for what we know, and this is in fact also a major source for each of these peoples, most of which did not, in fact, leave us anything. Actually, none of them left us anything like the Strategikon, but also in many cases did not leave us even anything written. I mean, think about the Avars, the Slavs, and so on. So it's a slightly different perspective sometimes, but when you look from obviously the ones, for example, these peoples would have described themselves, but at the same time, it's incredibly superimposable with all what we know, in fact, about these peoples and their ways of war, including other Byzantine sources, chronicling battles, campaigns, and they all make a lot of sense. So also the first part, as somehow ideal as it may sound, surely, again, has its own basis, this kernel of truth. This is valid for all of these manuals, telling the truth. Why did we talk about these manuals? Well, because if one wants to have an idea of how schematically, like the Roman army would fight throughout these several centuries, they would ideally have to go at least to some theoretical foundation provided by, in fact, works aiming at giving you the same. But as always, it's really a wider body of literature that provides you, and properly narrative sources in particular, with the necessary evidence of how to reconstruct the strategies and tactics of the Roman army during this period. You would also ask me, why do we talk now about the Roman army between 150 BC to 500 BC? Because in many ways this is the so-called imperial period. Telling the truth, the Roman army was already might to be reckoned from at least another century, but there is no doubt that a properly imperial and professional character only takes place starting more or less from that period. The 2nd century recruitment crisis is a bit of a sort of misnomer, right? There was never really a moment in which the Romans chronically lacked manpower. It was more like a political and social problem, how to actually provide those forces in the institutional framework of a decaying quote-unquote republic that they never actually called in that way, at least in paralleling the modern term that we use for it. The latter end is arbitrary. We could have extended it to the time of Heraclius. Actually, however, the mid-6th century in particular is such. He actually stopped in the age of Justinian, so actually it was by title. I don't know, I probably maintained 500. Maybe 550, because Justinian's plague really changes the face of the world. Even if in the moment probably they didn't realize how much, also in terms of military affairs, like it's difficult at some point to even speak of veritable reforms throughout specific times in history. There are very specific ones that at some point we will also focus more on, because how did these armies really change? Like, people have often an idea that there is an autocratic commander that basically arrives and changes the army that up to the day before was in a certain way. The reality of it is that these armies were already changing on their own, and these commanders, as politicians, came to essentially sanction the change, and therefore to also work well, for that matter, with the same armies to gain the reputation that it was, if anything, later attributed to them, anecdotally speaking. I think that Marius actually reformed the Roman army in any meaningful military sense, like that he actually started to quote-unquote uniform, whatever this means at this point, like all the various legionary equipment. Of course, the Roman armies looked like that already from quite a while. The cohorts were already around, possibly from a century. So we will get all into that, because it's also notorious for anyone, again, who knows the bare minimum about this topic. So when we get to the 6th century, we realize that there's a massive civilizational shrinking that will be heavily compounded by the later war against Persia, where Constantinople wins, but basically remaining exhausted together with the same Iranians, where the Arabs basically spread across this vast territory, not much by any particular power, but because they sort of toppled the local regime that in some cases probably was very much hated by the locals, and there were no resources to defend. And so the Byzantine Empire loses half of its territory in the following generations, mostly to the Muslims, and has probably to readapt to remold itself, in fact, on a very different system. I also made multiple videos on the thematic, in fact, quote-unquote reforms or army. So if you're interested in that, I've already provided. I'm glad that we are at a time in Schwerpunkt where we can say, okay, well, actually I tackled that very radical, crucial topic. Was it even, that was 2 videos for 1 episode, so to say, because the topic is so very important. And we will have to come back even more specifically from a military point of view, even a deeper military point of view on that, because it's really an epoch-making change. But even there, we realize it's mostly like a gradual change. So we mostly talk here in the latter period, the last great sort of late antique military that the Byzantines incarnated, and with which they successfully, in fact, reconquered most of the Mediterranean, what still function of that late antique mechanism. Lots of videos for that matter also in the 6th century, right? As we were saying before, the actually broader pool, and the one that really shows how literate you are in this topic, can be drawn from contemporary historical accounts, technical writings on subjects such as the construction of torsion artillery, even how again, marginal this can be overall, the building of encampments, veterinary practices, so everything gets into the cake, so to say, to as a recipe for the perfect ideal, or the perfect level of reconstruction possible, the Roman army. For not talking about artistic representations of battles, heroic poetry, this is particularly underrated, as well as obviously for the ancient world in consistent part, archaeological findings that, however, are virtually irrelevant without, in fact, this documentary evidence. Reconstructing Roman military organization and tactics is therefore, and will always be to some extent, an ongoing process of assembling often ill-fitting pieces from many different sources. On Schwerpunkt, personally, I never really liked talking about quote-unquote heresies whenever you have these repetitive videos about, did you get the Hoplitic phalanx wrong, or this kind, and then that's basically some sort of mental, it's better I don't say what, regarding some people that some decades ago decided to create a model that had nothing to do with what already historians like in the previous centuries already knew, say Hellenic warfare wasn't fought like. And so we should now be spending in turn like time and energy to debunk that, when it just suffices to have a decent classical education and experience with primary sources to reconstruct campaigns and battles, and having only through that like the best understanding of how in this case the Roman art of war really function, right? That's literally the only way for so many videos on the Hoplitic heresy I don't see many videos that reconstruct, as we do on Schwerpunkt, by the way, battle after battle of the Peloponnesian War from primary sources, and with the beautiful sort of morals, sort of in terms probably of explanation, but also in terms of same moral view of clashes, etc., that are really, in fact, the most important aspect of the war. As we were pointing out regarding even such an apparently banal thing like the sort of the order of Roman heavy infantry, gaps inevitably remain and must be bridged with recent conjecture. There are many ways of doing this, and mostly this proceeds by comparison, by analogy, so to say, also through a potent diachronic culture. It doesn't make any sense to study, I don't know, any ancient army without knowing anything about medieval, modern, contemporary armies, right? It just shows you the degree of misconception that you're going to unavoidably fall into, as you probably have no terms of comparison. If you study the art of war without particular scanning, you realize that certain things work always the same way, others change according to some degrees, that you also must have a powerful sort of political and social awareness regarding the various cultures of the various eras, and that therefore are practically unrelated with the idea of some deterministic, structuralistic, technicistic, and in the sense also completely abstract idea, conjecture how the Roman army would have worked just because you, for the first time, find from a tertiary source like one figure that you were going to spend among your friends just to show that you read something. Now, as we're also hinting at regarding archaeology, new discoveries frequently appear and need to be incorporated. There are many interesting ones, like it's from some years ago, for example, the first discovery of a fragment, at least, of a bronze lorica, so-called segmented armor, actually, that actually alone gives you a pretty obvious realization of how the history of technology really works, what kind of also materials were used, but how the design in some ways was more important than metal in dictating, in fact, the shape, the functionality, in order that at least the quality of armor can vary, but in a sort of practically expandable sense, what matters in a battle that we can't often reconstruct, in fact, for a time, is whether somebody would have had that armor or not, and how many were armored or unarmored, not what kind of type of armor, because at that point, the same metal could be different. And therefore, people try to fundamentally project some absolutes on how these armies really looked like in general terms, and just like as what I was saying before regarding the concept of uniformity. People read the term under the Marian reform, uniformed Roman legionary infantry in fundamentally homogeneous types based on the princeps model. So everybody thinks, most people really tend to think that this was uniform, that everybody looked like that, and that also within the same, say, corps, there wasn't a specific segmentation of the troops depending on how they were deployed in the array, etc., about which we don't know almost anything. So it's completely even useless to be particularly fixated with, unless you approach this with a degree of open-mindedness that fits, in fact, a sort of greater experience in the art of war matters. For this reason, the puzzle is still far from complete, leaving room for others to contribute, obviously, in the future, but bearing in mind what the limits are. There are certain things that do not know. When it gets to arms and armor, maybe the more time passes, the more we're going to find, but having some broader manualistic insight from, or even just historiographical insight from the ancient world is sort of quite complicated, especially for these topics. It's extremely unlikely, to say the least, that we're ever going to find a new hidden manuscript nobody had ever read that tells us specifically how, even in fragment, like a Roman legionary was specifically armored, right? Maybe it's easier to find underground frescoes, whatever, to tell us some of that in any case. You never have the picture of a broader army at work. You have, like in the beautiful columns, like depicting, as we were talking about the Marco Manni also the other day. You have, yes, an idea of how these guys would have looked like, also in units, information, but they are few overall. You don't have a beautiful sort of panoramic view of a Roman legion. These works, this artistry was always symbolic in many ways, which doesn't mean it wasn't accurate or realistic, but aside from obviously the divide existing between sort of celebratory monuments where things looked a bit fancier regarding how a soldier, for example, might have been kept, and the frontier that gives us something in archaeological terms that is obviously different. We today have a pretty good idea of this picture, but the most important thing is to stick to the realization that there is just so much that you can know about this. And I say it because, again, I come from a generation that, as we see from the internet, tended to be fundamentally obsessed with these ideas, because as moderns, and as mostly from different bias that I'm not going to explain, are fixated with technology, etc., we assume that what matters is simply what you have in your hands when you're fighting, as opposed to how much you want to rip off the guts of the person in front of you, right? And so when it comes also to reconstructing like this war gamistic idea, no, that's how they actually looked. Look, this is the only evidence that we have. You have to stick to that. That's not a serious thing, right? So if anything, it's what you have to do in order to grow knowledgeable about these topics is to read as much as you can, primary, secondary, tertiary sources, to get an idea of where we are ourselves, right? So as I was saying before, I'm not going to enter in how we see the Roman army, whether I like Devereux or you can criticize Luttbach or whatever. This is not so important. Maybe we're going to make some videos about this at some point. It can be interesting. What I mostly always stressed on Schwerpunkt, also because in continental Europe we tend to have this attitude, is go back to the primary sources. Always learn properly the semantic depth of terminology. Try to imagine this content. Look at battlefields. Like properly take the exact measures, the distances. Try to toy with that. Don't do like I will not say which channel, which pertains to fit, in fact, with video game means like an army in a specific landscape, without even wondering whether, I don't know, an army was deployed on a certain amount of ranks or another, and pretending that that's how the battle went, and now we know because I have a thing that projects how troops would have been deployed in a certain geographical space. So I'm not even going to descend into this. There is something that is military logical and is worth pursuing as a broader concept. Other things are simply unknown, and you should be reasonable enough to leave it at that. Unless something, again, comes up. In the meanwhile, we may be lucky, but we also have to be concrete. And studying, especially a lot of art of war from all eras, is crucial. And by the way, anyone undertaking this work of trying to better understand the Roman army should keep 3 hard-earned principles in mind. Never rely unquestioningly or on even the most eminent modern author or translator. This is incredibly important. This is something I said also in the video about Veritas and Caritas that got, I think, cut in the recording because that's about a point, but there was that atrocious mistranslation from the Loeb translator that O'Connelly made decades ago, that basically translated the Libo-Phoenician long heavy javelin as pike, as sarissa, literally, like the Macedonian phalanx, bringing lots of people after him to literally presume that the Carthaginian army had Macedonian phalanxes. Style infantry, sort of, and which was impossible for a series of reasons that if you know about properly the nature of Punic politics and society, could have not been the same. It's even unlikely that Zama was any of the Macedonian reinforcements that actually a source points out, considering the disastrous economic situation which Macedon found itself at the end of the 3rd century BC. And and all you find still in ospreys, for example, this ridiculous picture of the Carthaginian pike bearer, which is absolutely ridiculous, and is meant, in fact, to refer also to the Lonke as well. This for telling you how bad certain, even the lack properly of linguistic competence can be for studying this stuff. But it's something deeper. It really, if you have never really encountered specific intellectual figures, I had the luck back in the day to do so, that properly acquaint you with the depth and the complexity of this for apparently banal topics, like how in fact a weapon was named in the sources. So like you can't go that far. I tried my best on Schwerpunkt, but really slowly covering all the Hellenistic era period, and you always have from primary sources incredibly beautiful and revealing concepts that are much more important than any technical description for that matter. So always return to the original sources. That's first and foremost the most important thing. So from there, you should be able to develop a thorough knowledge of military techniques from both before and after the period in question. You can't, again, and even beyond, as I said before, you can't pretend to understand what the Roman manipular legion was if you have no idea why it even came up. And obviously avoiding to fill up the gap of trying to explain this by making up some fantasy conjectures. There is a proper historiography. There are sources alone if you just want to start from the primary ones. Equally, you should also ask yourself, but what was really this manipular legion? Why did we actually come up with this concept itself? And why do we call it like that? How it came into being? How, on which on which timeline? Because again, armies always change, so you can't even stop saying, okay, well, at some point Maurice arrived and there's the Courtal legion. No, it was basically the same army, and the sooner, in fact, you abandon this kind of categorization, the more sort of open and focused on the continuum you are, the better it's going to be. Because frankly, these armies were practically all the same. Like in sedentary Europe, in the Mediterranean, what kind of armies fought in a different way from heavy infantry, equipped more or less in the same way. I mean, the same term phalanx is notoriously used by the Greeks for practically any kind of heavy infantry they ever encountered, which obviously doesn't mean that they fought literally in the same identical way, but it was even terminologically speaking, a much looser term that is meant, in fact, something else in particular, probably a steam rolling, so to say, tree log, right? That's probably, in fact, steamrolled the enemy forces. Other very important thing is avoid assuming that any newly noticed detail has never been observed before, that opposing arguments do not exist. This is literally the best arena to properly demolish your own opinions, right? You have to wrestle with them, and that especially realize that there is a wide historiography on these topics already, and that this historiography in turn is also right or wrong, right? Don't do like normally the Anglosphere academic culture did, that is putting on the fore scholarship as opposed to primary sources, especially as far as ancient history is concerned. And given that the evidence is fairly limited, I mean, for the Middle Ages, you can't study all the sources in, say, even just Western Europe. Like, nobody can. There are too many, right? So you can be more or less expert on these areas or not. For the ancient world, at least if you take, say, I don't know, the Greeks, the Romans, that after all are where most of our information comes from to begin with, like, you can't kind of dominate that in your lifetime. If you focus on the military side of the story, that is feasible, right? But in this sense, you should be able to read, for example, again, well, I will not make, as promised, scholarly examples because I would digress too much. But in general, like, we have also a level of capacity in general to spot whether something that we have started to build as a system with a lot of knowledge that makes sense within it is actually compatible with what others say, right? Personally, in historiography, I always found a lot of categorism, especially in the 80s, in the 90s, and so on. Like, there's always this sense when you read these articles from back then, and even in part, like in the following decades, that there is this obsession with fixing categorical milestones, like saying this was this type of army, then it changed into this separate. Doesn't make any sense. That's also what the aforementioned hoplitic heresy sort of came from. And yet people also, unfortunately, focus on this iconoclasm by presuming that since, look, the scholar was wrong, haha, you're not better than the scholar, right? You know, the scholar that came up with that knew something more and better than you, but also, especially when you are to explain the broader picture, in general, you tend, as an average person, not to be particularly more competent in any case than that scholar, not to have particular bias, right? From the hoplitic heresy, we still have videos online that claim things like that the Greeks could not have a thickly packed heavy infantry because Greece has mountains. As if, like, this is serious. This is a serious problem. Like, if you don't understand that, of course, there is plenty of room for Hellenic phalanxes to have actually worked the way they're pretty unequivocally described as heavy infantry, because that's how heavy infantry fundamentally worked to begin with, say, in Thucydides, in Herodotus, in Xenophon, and so, like, it's a bit complicated to claim that you are this great dismantler that's using reason, because you are still at the level of, if there are mountains in the hinterland, I don't know, there are not fertile plains or places where to clash also, or simply the phalanx couldn't even simply go into more rugged terrain fundamentally. So it really depends on many things, and in general, even the debunking sounds a bit too categorical and heretical, probably in attitude and mindset. And that's unfortunately how polluted we are from an intellectual point of view, from this point of view. And so let's look at some of these aspects, and then naturally will and can profitably spark some further scholarly controversy and debate and everything. But that here we present obviously as a YouTube channel where I made thousands of videos mostly about the art of war. I have, as you know, my professional background specifically in the field, and I think can be useful to anyone who wants to approach this topic. Now, some things I'm going to say are probably going to sound particularly banal, right? But we also have to start from the core elements, otherwise we can't descend in other details and considerations that are especially relevant, in part, as we'll see now, concerning things we already said in this video. For example, let's start from this concept, the fact that at the heart of the Roman army throughout its history stood the legio, the legion, a large, well-drilled infantry formation trained primarily or at times exclusively for close combat. This already could be profitably debated, meaning that, again, heavy infantry was fundamentally the bulk of not just the Roman army, as we'll see now, many other militaries out there, but it doesn't mean that legionnaires were incapable of fighting in other fashions or circumstances. Just there were other troops that historically were cheaper and more specialized at the same time, coming from the subject peoples that could work like in that, in fact, secondary roles that were, again, more dangerous, but could, in fact, require less specialized all-round training like the legionnaires that are, maybe this is a provocatory concept, but consider the legionnaires being probably the knights in a traditional sense of the Roman legion, not because they weren't the equites, they were the proper knights with their sort of prime chivalric tradition. I made an entire video that I don't like to make to title that way, but that is quite importantly so for this specific topic, namely the fact that the Romans had actually a pretty darn good cavalry, probably citizen cavalry. It was incredibly qualitative, and it seems like the pop culture has not gotten the memo on this. On the contrary, for reasons I'm not going to digress on, they attribute greater cavalry capacity to peoples that actually did not have the level of Roman cavalry command or training, or even equipment for that matter. And that's somehow disappointing. Don't get me wrong, those were the proper knights, right? So what I'm talking about regarding the legionaries is mostly the fact that these were freemen, and therefore conceptually, and you have to watch the videos on Roman religion and metaphysics for that, the proper freemen and noblemen of the world as such. Because yes, obviously Roman society legionaries were fundamentally plebeians in origin. They could come from different backgrounds, telling the truth. Nothing prevented people from a higher order to enlist. There were different ways of doing that, in fact, considering the status at the same time. But not just the Romans, in this sense, thought of themselves as God's chosen people for world conquest, but they actually carried out the latter, right? So even the fourth estator in the Roman military, as a Roman citizen, was a metaphysically superior lord over all the subjected peoples, as a matter of fact. This is true also for other populations as well. And so while the concept of freemen is eroded ipso facto by this same idea, also comparing different freemen across different peoples, at the same time, the idea of the cingulum militaris, and I say this mostly because I'm a medievalist, as you know, is deeply embedded, in fact, in the same Roman legionary tradition. What becomes the cingulum militaris in the ecclesiastical pronunciation in the Middle Ages is not derived merely from the equus, right? It's derived from he who bears the sword in the world to begin with. And so it's a much higher sacred principle, right? It's not to say, of course, that auxiliaries did not bear the sword, but they bore that because the Romans decided to, right? And they were often also equipped by the Romans with their own, in fact, arms and armor, even horses at some point, but obviously they were subordinated to the Romans. And if you think about it, you have this core of heavy legionary infantry that constituted fundamentally half of the Roman military, then the other half were auxiliaries, and it was a pretty, actually, well, here we go through different stages. Initially, there weren't even too many. If you consider properly the Principate, you have basically just 250,000 men controlling the empire already at the peak territorial extension. It's something sort of minimal if you think about all the people who lived across the world, and not just inside what we consider the Roman Empire, but also outside, and especially that if you also consider what happened in the later period as well. So I don't know how much I'm going to digress regarding these topics, but in this sense, the quality of the legionnaire also in maintaining the various subject populations all across the empire through their heavy infantry nature is in itself the demonstration that they were decisive over these other peoples, at parity of numbers, right? One auxiliary per legionnaire, all right? You know this stuff. I don't think there's much to digress on, but if you're interested, obviously I made plenty of videos on the Roman army. I have an entire playlist dedicated to this. We talked about how fundamentally the Italians did this, how the later Roman army transformed from who was a Roman in late antiquity, and in this sense, why was there some further certification of the military in quality and competence in this sense. I presume you know that, and as we go on here, given we're talking all these various eras, we're talking essentially several hundred years, lots of changes really occurred in the meanwhile. Now, unlike the spear pike armed heavy infantry of the Hellenes, the Punics, or the Macedons, who kept their long weapons in hand for thrusting, Roman legionnaires seem to have relied on a combination of hand-thrown missiles and sword. So, close combat, including with missile element. And people somehow tend to distinguish, however, the Romans from these other populations, as well as from, for example, the Celts or the Germans, the Dacians, a bit too much. As we remain in the sedentary world, so steppes excluded, more or less, we actually are looking at pretty similarly looking, by the way, armies to begin with. If you had seen, I don't know, the Romans fighting in the plains of northern Germany under Drusus against the Langobardi, so to say, at this high, the Suebi, etc., like, you would have probably looked like a striking overall similarity of the types of hosts, right? It may seem strange, but these are all people. Aside from people who are obsessed with racial differences across Europe, that did exist, but, aside from the fact that Roman legionaries were selected for height, but that the overall height difference was just a few inches between southern and northern Europe, and aside from the relatively different genetic makeup of, in fact, otherwise very similar Europe to today's in those terms, the ways to form the lines, how to engage with one another, historically were always very similar. There wasn't much to change. Like, it's completely false that the barbarians did not have an order or a discipline. It's completely false that the Romans won by technology, or people somehow are schizophrenic regarding things. It's either quantity or quality, depending on what kind of enemies they would like not to have been defeated by the Romans. And as we were saying before, even when we get to the Hellenistic model, or better, the Phalangitic one, because even the Carthaginians were Hellenistic, as we explained before. They didn't have Saraceni, but Hellenism is more like, in the military field, a school of war, right? It's combined arm tactics. The Carthaginians actually even surpassed the Macedonian combined arms, that in turn, however, had also been proper of armies like, I don't know, the Achaemenid one for that matter, even though each one with their own specific bias. So when we look at, for example, the Romans fighting against the Macedons, right, in the first centuries, in the 2nd century, the 3rd century before Christ, the actual makeup there is also pretty similar. The fact that the Macedons had spears, by the way, were not even particularly long, right? Depending on there is all a question in terms of the actual figures, like the measuration reference. They had probably 4 to 5 meters long pikes, right? They weren't something incredibly long. It takes a lot of training, and Saracens were incredibly costly. They added enormously, by the way, to the already pretty heavy cost of having properly some heavy infantry trained, intensely trained for this, maintaining alignment, this massive forces. By the way, for a phalanx, like, must not be properly outflanked, because it is true that in close combat there is a different dynamic compared to the more aggressive Romans, in a sense. There was a moral difference, this is true, but that's in fact the most important one that eventually allows the Romans to take over. The Macedonian phalanx was never frontally broken, not even at Pydna. Basically, the Romans break that. It's the phalanx that sort of breaks by itself, even though, again, Polybius's account can be profitably criticized for that matter, because he's trying to make sense, to positivistically and rationalistically tell us why the Romans prevailed. He didn't have actually a clue, because he had never really seen himself, regardless of his early military experience. In fact, a Roman Manipular legion and a Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx fight against one another, without mentioning, of course, this was still a combined armed tactics system, so there was cavalry, there were missile troops that are, however, the lights. Most of cavalry can be heavy or light, but I mean, mostly the same problem of outflankment occurred for the Romans as well. It's the idea that the Macedons would simply raise their pikes and surrender or flee once they were outflanked, whereas the Romans, were fine. We have been attacked on the flank and would have kept going fighting, is actually not the case. There are lots of battles. We've seen, most famously, Pharsalus last summer, that actually end basically with the outflanking, even though, of course, that wasn't uniquely what made that per se, but virtually, like, once you were outflanked, you tended to break under, obviously, the pressure, in fact, of the enemy heavy infantry in the center, right? The Romans also fought against some kind of earlier hoplitic phalanx, even though we don't clearly understand the extent of this, also because most of the powers who used that were small poleis and that had failed essentially to develop that more updated Macedonian system. So even, again, the notion that the Roman legionaries would simply fight with their swords and nothing else can be profitably criticized. Surely many of them actually fought with spears, right, that were part of their equipment throughout a great part of the entire era. And so even though there is probably a conceptual and heroic vision in the idea of unseating the gladius and properly launching yourself at the assault of the enemy formations, and the Romans did that because they complemented that with heavy javelins, as you know, before the charge. They could also fight in different ways, and we don't know actually that much about that. One thing I missed before, that it's, however, pretty common for me to say in these videos normally, is that the fact that we actually don't, I already said that we don't know what these armies actually looked like on the field, right? But especially, like when we look at the Roman army, for all the things we know, we realize that in relative terms, this knowledge is pretty scarce, right? We know a lot about the Roman military because there was something called the Roman Empire, right? But in qualitative terms, we do not know the Roman army better than, say, the classical era Hellenic phalanx, right? Because the people who wrote about this were different, right? In classical Hellas, you could have the same people who fought in the phalanx writing to you and telling you name by name all the people who had fallen at battles like Marathon or Plataea, that we also covered recently for that matter. Nobody hears a Roman proletarian telling us about his deeds in Gaul, in Egypt, etc. Like it's a completely different scenario, which is absolutely valid for the Hellenistic world as well. I mean, we know definitely much more, but disproportionately more about classical Hellenic tactics than Hellenistic Macedonian ones. This is notorious because simply the composition of those armies, the political context of revenues is very different, and so society is very different, and we get, as a consequence, different type of sources for that, right? Without mentioning that when we look at the phalangitic tradition, we're looking perhaps at the single most exceptional way of war that developed in the ancient world. As I try to explain here, the fact of having, again, spears and pikes, even that require, if anything, enhanced training and work with a pretty effective, in fact, frontal stopping and also aggressive capacity, because that was the point, is, in fact, the product of Hellenistic civilization, right? However, not just the same classical Greece already fought as with spears, like that was the primary weapon, in fact, of most peoples, including the Italics, the Latins, the Romans, at some point. And we will talk more about the archaic Roman army and explain. Actually, the genesis of manipular tactics is my possibly most favorite topic ever in military history, but for some reason I still haven't made a video about it. I could talk about it for hours on end. The overall picture, right, is that not just the spear is the primary weapon of most peoples out there, but that the notion of having a spear and or multiple spears / javelins was basically standard across Europe and the Mediterranean. All right, it wasn't much about the Roman legionnaire that taken in himself was fundamentally revolutionary, exceptional, or anything that other peoples also hadn't faced, right? When we look at the same Roman arms and armor designs, this is valid for many other peoples out there, telling the truth. Segmented armor here, we were talking about segmented armor for Maurya, India, in the sort of centuries before the Romans came in contact with, or actually in the same centuries, the Romans came into contact with the same Macedons. Frankly, and God knows since when they existed, there is segmented armor also in Mesopotamia. What does this mean? Is that the Romans, quote-unquote, copied this? No. So let's erase this other nonsense that the Romans basically didn't have anything unique. They had a very specific Italic background that produced weapons like the scutum, the same pilum. These were all essentially Italic born because they were pretty much everywhere since ever. Like the idea of having a heavier javelin and a broader oval shield, it fit the broader purpose that would have existed all across Europe. There is no derivation from, for example, the Celts. They were just all basically the same people even at some point. And we'll talk better about this topic as well. But in this sense, it's obvious that the Roman legionnaire was no different, practically in a conceptual sense, from any type of soldier that had historically existed in this broader, sort of borderline barbarian and Hellenistic world, right? And that, of course, the Romans, as the dominant, universal, ecumenic world power of the era, develop and improve also on previous models. This is particularly to be seen in, for example, also military engineering. The Greeks had already, like during the Hellenistic era, pioneered lots of stuff. The Romans basically come on top of that and fix it, adapt it to their own needs. Technology, again, also especially of that kind, is somehow overrated, in explaining also how the Roman military, for instance, the Adocoid one was successful, as a matter of fact. But in this sense, even the adaptation of the legionnaire, sort of the more iconic, again, segmented armor, shingle, squared shield, the manica, whatever, let's say the Dacian Wars era, or Trajanic legionnaire, so to say, is, aside from incredibly varying from the same iconography of the very era, the very context, just like the enhancement and the perfection, in that case, the heavier infantrymen, more heavily armored infantry, it costs really a lot, by the way. So for armies with hundreds of thousands of men, you also have to ask yourself about how many did actually the possibility to be equipped like that on a regular basis. Just of a model had already existed before, right? It doesn't quite change that much overall. And so we can digress on the basis of this model all the different aspects of Roman combat. Think about the initial missile of the pilum proper, the pila plural, because they normally used more of them, right? As far as we understand, they had two, right? And they were modulated at some point for the very specific range they had to throw them from at a very specific moment of the charge. Right, the pilum was mostly used in an offensive sense, even though from Caesar, for example, we have instances, of course, use it defensively. It could go both ways. We just don't know in which circumstances most pila would also be spent. For example, between a charge and another, these battles that lasted entire days. Presumably, they skirmished, even just like the functionally throwing all these unmasked heavy javelins at the moment of the charge, which was also the thing. And guess what? Other peoples did exactly the same. What do you think that, I don't know, the Celts or the Iberians or whomever had actually javelins for? Like, they didn't throw them before the charge. Maybe they were not, on average, so heavily drilled, like the, in fact, rigidly disciplined Roman heavy infantry. But in general, also the sense that the Romans were just the most hyper-disciplined, and that's how they just won. It's not quite correctly how the Romans just won. There isn't just discipline in war. That helps a lot, and obviously the Roman military topped practically any opponent in that, but you don't just win because of that, right? Otherwise, nobody else would take the field against you, which admittedly, as we were hinting at before, so with the Catili, that was often the case, especially in fact at the fringes of the world. In any case, the pilum is this heavy, short-range weapon cast just before contact. It could pierce armor, lodge in an enemy shield, encumbering and unbalancing the opponent. This seems to have, in fact, been the aforementioned perfectionment of the typical heavy javelin used by these other peoples. And by the way, many legionnaires would be across the centuries the same peoples, right, at some point. And it had developed over centuries with socketed or tank design, sometimes weighted, and while many bent on impact, rendering reuse difficult. Recent analysis and experimental tests suggests not all did so intentionally or dramatically, by the way. Bending could occur on ground strikes or when wrenching the weapon free, but the long shank primarily enabled deep shield penetration and disabling rather than deliberate sabotage, right, with Maurice era innovations, possibly involving a weak wooden pin to cause twisting instead, though archaeological evidence again indicates this redesign was not universally adopted either. And so it's not really the point per se, it's just considering who used them and why, especially if you understand this, that as we were pointing out before in the ratio between legionnaires and auxiliaries, that the Romans evolved from a people, again, so from this warlike, tribal, Italic background, always using the auxiliaries in the form of the Salci that were, however, fighting basically as the Romans fought. There wasn't much of a difference. They could be subject people at some point, less affluent, but we know also from the social war that the forces were indistinguishable. There's even a passage from the Second Punic War that tells us that actually, like, at least the front ranks of the Carthaginian army looked, they had lots of Italics among them at that point, but in Hannibal's Italy, so to say, were indistinguishable from the Roman ones with the scutum and everything. So the notion is that there is a phase in which the Romans again emerge as probably an ethnic people from the Apennine Peninsula, and in that sense they have to make up for every kind of soldier, right? If you look at, say, the Polybian era, more or less, at least the typical Polybian archetype, so to say, was an all-around army where Italics in general, whether Romans or allies, this was not so important, performed practically every single tactical task. Think about the Velites, and so also Italic cavalry that was more numerous than the Roman citizenry one. They were a fully complete army. And so we have eventually this idea that in the Marian era, instead, you have, in fact, ever less national cavalry, so to say. You don't have apparently the Velites anymore. We know that, again, the Roman legionnaires had skirmishers, citizen skirmishers throughout the period, so there is no doubt about this. But overall, the idea is that everything shrinks to some sort of heavy infantry model that is just assisted by specialized auxiliaries, as we were saying before. And so, therefore, also our understanding that these people more or less fought with this combination, and only in the later antiquity returned into this overall now all apparently homogenized Roman army that had also exhausted a bit the tactical specialties of the various peoples that had that, in fact, as an ethnic hallmark of the military capacity in the same Roman service as auxiliaries, had to revert to skirmishers, to archers, to everything that before had historically just been deputed to the allies, that kept existing, by the way. If you look at, I don't know, the army of Theodosius or the one of Justinian, you find all kind of auxiliaries from Goths to Turks, etc. So I think about the Simmacari. These were these peoples that were at some point during the 3rd century crisis and after the constitution of the so-called Constitutio Antoniniana, since auxiliaries were basically spent, like all peoples in the empire had somewhat gentrified at least, were called from outside the empire itself. And this may sound strange in a time in which the sort of outside the empire peoples were starting to press at the frontier, wanted to get it. It's actually part of the same mechanism, also turning these guys against the others, and so extending further the range of recruitment, because the other out beyond the quote-unquote borders that in this sense do not exist, because one of the greatest misconceptions about the Roman army is that basically they just controlled the peoples inside the empire, whereas they actually considered equally the peoples outside the empire, right? Why do you think that the Germans stayed quiet for centuries when the Romans were just next door? And it's partly Roman stability, but that goes in parallel with their military power. They controlled literally also for hundreds of kilometers well beyond the Rhine and the Danube, because they had a massive deterrent, by the way, concentrated, as you know, with their legions, like constituting the greatest force along those river frontiers. And so you have really lots of very interesting things going on in a way you can't picture the Roman army. Over time, back to the Pilum, this javelin was first supplemented and later largely replaced by lighter, longer-ranging projectiles. And in fact, this is an illusion that we just explained. Like, it's not like heavier javelins did not exist or something similar to them. Designs were gradually changing, but I mean, how different can a javelin be after all, certainly in a pre-industrial context? Because you have, again, not just the legionary as the heavily armored, or at least in any case, heavy infantrymen. You have lighter troops in the same Roman army as they became Roman and needing to perform these lighter elements, these lighter functions as well. Just like also many peoples back in the early days, like, were fighting with Rome with lighter javelins. They were also such universal weapons that we do know, in fact, the same Roman legionaries could switch to in particular circumstances in different types of combat, while the heavy infantry consistently carried an effective sword. At first, the Gladius Hispaniensis type. Again, this is what we're looking at today. Obviously, I have actually another video incoming on archaic Roman weapons for that matter. There's this notion that the Gladius Hispaniensis would have been a short weapon. This is nonsensical. Like, I mean, not even the Mainz and Pompeii types, or like that were objectively more better suited, at least for thrusting in close quarters, absolutely weren't daggers as we intend them, right? In the Gladius Hispaniensis, even less, right? It was a pretty brilliant combination of essentially Latin swords and some kind of Iberian falcata curved blades, sort of fusion in one, with a very center shift, in fact, towards the tip, which is in fact not much actually something used for thrusting, but also for chopping, as if you look at the description of the Battle of Cunoscaphalae, the Macedons found out the hard way with limbs and heads severed with ease, and by the way, in the hands of sort of incredibly bloodthirsty, again, Italic soldiers, and the Romans were properly channeling, even with their tribal background and fantasy, but still at this point already within at this point a rigidly disciplined sort of order, exalting still their individual side of the story. So nobody really understands why these wars would have been short, that they actually weren't. Then, of course, there is a greater length towards the later period, exemplified by the spada, that, however, becomes also more elite weapon, right? And not just in comparison, in fact, to the now newly stratified lighter infantry. Like, there was sort of more of a spear use in late antiquity, at least it seems. And again, we have probably this relatively false picture, mostly stemming from the early imperial period, where we think the legionary was just basically a swordman, because most of the auxiliaries, as factota, basically used the spear, like in most circumstances, but the legionnaires used that too. And here we are listing, by the way, type of equipment that in fact would have been similar to the ones of other peoples as well. You have the helmet evolving, in this case, from the Montefortino or Colus types, for example, in the earlier period, to imperial Gallic or Italic styles, and then things change once again toward the later period with some more Iranic influence styles, especially for the elite, that becomes ever more knightly, together with the spada and ever more cheaply produced helmets, such as the Intercisa. I made an entire video about that, and it's if the early Montefortinos had been cheap enough that it could be used by tribesmen as well historically, and given properly to the Marian mules as well. The Intercisa are also the product of late Roman fabric and the concentration of arms and armor production, especially in the core regions of the empire, better controlled by the state, which was not quite a thing even when, in fact, there were properly private manufacturers that were subcontracted with probably the public, with the army, arms and armor production. We hear of them since the time of Cicero, right? So actually after Marius, a bit after, a generation after, that we can document naturally. But things would have worked similarly also before. In fact, we know very few about this, but we can kind of understand it on the basis of how already Roman society worked. That the idea of the state supplying arms and armor, the fact that in part these were still considered as sort of a property temporarily entrusted to the soldiers, also into the early imperial era, and is all mixed with what we were saying before regarding the uniformity of it. We think of uniformed troops because they had somehow homogenized themselves towards a tactical function, but not because they actually looked all alike. Actually, you could, on top of the statally issued weapons, also equip yourself with something more, something better, depending on who you were. We find plenty of this. That does not stop to decorations. Obviously, there was a functional level of hand-to-hand combat, whereas you would have not found, like, I don't know, a Roman legionnaire with a double-handed axe just on a regular basis. But if you think about the dolabra, and so the Roman pickaxe that was said to be this more operationally effective, considering all the heavy military engineering that the Roman military did. I mean, the Roman legionary is technically an assault engineer. That even that weapon was used, in fact, with great effect, especially against armored opponents, very often saying Romans. Armor, as you know, developed from the favored iron mail, Lorica amata. Amata stands for properly hooked, right? Because of the various rings to iron plate at some point, at least. They overlapped, obviously. I don't even need to point it out. The Lorica segmentata is actually a modern term. They just call it as body armor, right? For example, we would say cuirass, but cuirass looks more like the musculata, properly full plate armor that they could have. I mean, full to the extent of the torso. It's interesting because plate armor has always existed in the form even just of helmets or greaves or other parts. But the idea is that they surely had some vocabulary at the time that we're also not specifically aware of to describe different types of armor. All right. The chainmail armor remained more widespread as far as we understand. Probably the segmented one was sort of very well represented and found also in archaeological context, but not uniformly issued. Also because, again, the state probably and likely did not have the means to even issue, not necessarily this or that armor, but a type of armor just per se, or spending extra for that. They didn't care. It's just like the idea of color uniformity. We surely think that at a company level, such as like the one of a maniple, right? They would have, or a battalion, they had some mean locally, because some of these troops, or at least the troops equipped themselves in part with locally produced, including arms and armor. They had smiths. They had, if you know, of the various forts, as we were saying, the ones where the legions were mostly stationed for hundreds of years, especially along the Rhine, the Danube, but not only, wherever they were. They had their own local arms and armor production. They didn't really wait, I don't know, for the Mediterranean to send them armor. They produced it locally, right? And there was all, in fact, a level of exchange of monetization, logistical systems that, yes, did help. At some point, there was the mean to send large amounts of arms and armor here and there, especially for the major expedition. Actually, the depots of this arms and armor were eventually sent from these legionary bases to, for example, I don't know, when the Dacian wars broke out and Trajan probably invaded Dacia in big scale, like surely from all the empire, arms and armor were sent, including from legionary camps, fortifications that were turning into cities, basically. Also on far away frontiers, right? We've seen partially the logistics of the Trajanic army already. We'll come back on it. But probably the costs, even, for example, of dye, right? Dyeing, allegedly, even if they had wanted to do so, like the Roman army all in one color, this was an incredible expense. The state would have never paid for that. It was completely useless. Again, the identification normally happened through like the various units in an autonomous way, and it functioned pretty well. This is true also for other peoples. They had a partial level of uniformity, even among the barbarians, by the way. But that, in this sense, did not require a super structure that would start paying, like showering them with the stuff. It did not exist, not even in late antiquity, technically, with the fabricative things worked that way. They just sort of complemented these other sort of also private types of subcontracted types of arms and armor provision production for the army. You have I will not spend here much words to compare the various types of armor and how they were effective or not effective here and there. I would say only this, that, when, first of all, in terms of material, it doesn't matter if, you're fighting in the Syrian desert and you're cooking inside the armor, or at least it's incredibly uncomfortable to fight into it. Like, if you have to save your life from Parthian arrows, that's actually okay, all right? You will not exchange it for lighter armor. At least in general, it could happen, but it depended more on who you were, tactically, operationally speaking, than the obvious thing that happened, I don't know, also during the Crusades, apparently, like the Latins were more lightly equipped in the Holy Land than they were in Europe, right? But it also depended on the type of enemy they were fighting, for example. So again, environmental factors are probably BS, as much as the allegedly specialized type of anti-arrow is often said, like the segmented armor was introduced because of they started fighting in the East. It's plenty of segmented armor in Britain, for that matter. It's just a good type of armor like another. It has this design, it has pros and cons that you would have had mostly to test in actual historical action. But it didn't even really matter. What mattered in battle was to have metal armor to begin with, covering your torso in the first place, right? And really making an important change tactically, operationally, logistically, and so on. You could also switch, right? Again, also auxiliaries had the heavier type of armor given certain tasks that were entrusted in certain cases. There was nothing really fixed about it. There were surely some type of armor that were better suited, for example, to counter archery. We understand that peoples in the steppes tended to have more sort of scale armor to a degree, and that is kind of functional, but it's also not everything, right? You're not simply, obviously, you're not immune from arrow fire, but also it's not just what you get, right? And consider always that when we see, for example, some enemies that fight, some troops in general that fight, including the Romans, as it was habitual also for most of the Middle Ages, for that matter, with, a heavily armored rider and the horse does not have armor, you would think, well, why? If the first thought is the horse gets hit, and the horse is very resilient in terms of power and strength, dosage, and over the distance and whatever, but it's notoriously incredibly vulnerable. If it gets crippled, it's useless, right? And war horses cost a lot, but we tend to forget always the most important aspect: collective training in tactics. Meaning, if you know how to carry out a cavalry charge at speed, like as heavies, there is no light element that stops you, right? The myth also that everything can be beaten with missile warfare, that Cartwright would have allegedly showed these terrible tactics that the Westerners were at loss with. It's absolute BS. Actually, the Romans were stronger than the Parthians. Also, especially from a tactical point of view, given that the Parthians had to recur to that hit-and-run tactics to successfully wear out the Romans. This goes on forever. And also, again, during the Crusades, you have the more heavily armored Westerners that advance, and the Turks can't quite stop because they don't have enough heavies for doing that, even though the Parthians have cataphracts, and obviously there is always a combined armed tactics. In fact, the systems are pretty balanced, but it's not because of this type of weapon or this type of armor, all right? And tendentially, again, there are also these differences between actual overall quality of the army or not. We had, by the way, all kind of arms and armor in ways that I'm surely going to cover in different videos, because when it gets to circled military units, as you know, I'm quite pedantic also about the various range of weapons that could be employed. We have things like a rawhide sort of leather. We have, indeed, like these were used in certain contexts, and it really depended on the availability. On it was not a standard choice for a unit in particular. It could be in a moment, right? For a specific action, a specific task, but not quite. You have mail again, likely being the prevalent type of armor across the period. You have scale gaining traction in the later Roman period, even though this likely had to do also with the fact that we're increasingly looking at an Eastern Roman Empire, all right? And so one that, by the way, during the migration era received an avalanche of peoples against them from the steppes, from areas that normally made more use of scale, particularly because we think, again, that being there more archery in the East, this type of armor was essentially more functional at stopping it. If you're interested in these topics, by the way, made lots of videos about especially steppes warfare from antiquity to throughout the millennia, basically. And so you can see how even particular designs of scale armor changed at a point. I also made an entire video on scale armor per se, so you'll find likely this in the topics comment down below as usual. Shields, we were discussing them before, progress from oval to squared off oval, then rectangular. The standard name was scutum, just like gladius was the sword, as we've seen before. The terminology, the Romans were pretty dry in terms of terminology. They had actually a beautiful language and deep semantics. We've made lots of videos about Indo-European theology, true linguistics, right? And there's always, in fact, a metaphysical concept behind these names that we also have buried, unfortunately, as moderns. On Schwerpunkt, we're trying to bring back to further. And actually, like these types of shield were, let's say, the rectangular ones, so to say, in particular, were also the squared off oval. Sort of, there is an increase actually in the type of convexness of the shields, because as the legionnaire got heavier, the sense is that they could get also more into melee, paradoxically on their own. So also defining a bit the notion that they would be merely just like this short range, like especially the swords would have been shorter for that. It did have a point, and again, we don't know how to reconcile 100% this ergonomic, anatomic functionality, so to say, which the arms and armor were tailored. However, the notorious, like the more convex the shield is, actually the more suited for individual combat or relatively isolated combat, still within a formation for sure, was. And given that you can't really, for example, overlap this shield in any functional sense, they're not flat enough, unlike the earlier scuta, as a matter of fact, as it's true also among other peoples for that matter. So being very careful, because remember the thing I said about the Roman knightly ethos, like people tend to modernize and secularize the image of Rome for many different political reasons. It can be, I don't know, it can be the left, the right. They all have their social, racial reasons. And the truth is that, in this sense, a Roman legionnaire, again, stereotypically with this shingle type of shield, a heavily armored, etc., was more akin to a knight of sort at the time of Trajan than the average rank and file sort of Central European tribal warrior was, with a shield that we understand were tendentially flatter and sort of better suited for some kind of more levy kind of mentality and background, and therefore array for overlapping and so on. It's not to say that sort of great warriors could not fight with flatter shields, but tendentially, right, the anthropological and opological dimension there overlap in quite self-evident terms in a military context. The idea, for example, that the semi-cylindrical shape of the more developed Roman shield would be more suited for the so-called testudo formations is fairly inconsistent, right? First of all, the testudo is just an emergency nature. It's not a standard formation or even less a way of combat, etc. It's basically like something you perform when you are in a terrible situation where you're under fire but with no cover, right? But we have Gauls back in the day putting, again, shields on their heads as the Romans were bombarding them at the point at the end of a battle, as they had, in fact, surrounded them. So if you have a shield, if you have a unit, like when you're under fire out there in the open, you will carry out a quote-unquote testudo, the Latin term that Romans used to describe those Gauls as well. So there is nothing unique about this as far as Rome goes. The Romans would have been, on average, like their legionaries better drilled than the average rank and file sort of fighter out there in the world. What I've always thought, and if you especially enter the spiritual and theological understanding of Romanity and the empire towards the early Roman period, you understand how the legionnaire towered over this body of subjected auxiliaries. So you realize how these changes are actually more functional to not necessarily an individual combat per se, but a greater durability in hand-to-hand combat as a single individual that is capable, that doesn't necessarily have to overly rely over close order to be effective. In fact, the Romans never lose that sense of being partially individualistic and partially disciplined. This is a legacy that comes straight out of, again, that Italic warrior that is brutalized to the point of being rigidly disciplined, but unleashing his individual fury in times of battle. The Romans were obsessed with decapitations, with single combat and other feats. It's rather in late antiquity, where the entire world is exhausting itself, that you see, in fact, a much greater reliance on things like shield walls. They are also not really a formation. They're just how you normally protect yourself in the front. In fact, it's not like the Romans would not use that also with semi-cylindrical shields in the front. They would often maintain a close order, just we don't know, as we were explaining before, on which regularity. We have no way to measure that in practice. And so oval, round, especially round shields in later times would appear. The round shields were used either by the lighter troops. Think about the velitas in the early days. So it's at that point, like the shield is designed more or less to protect your torso, and so more or less uniform way. And the smaller the shield is, sort of technically, it doesn't make sense for it to be asymmetrical, all right? Because it's more like having this little thing, this sort of smaller surface to protect yourself in a generic sense, and so with no geometric difference. Or you have larger round shields that, in this sense, do not cover your thighs, like the oval shield that was, again, more or less the standard, as we've seen pretty much everywhere, all across Europe. The Celts, the Iberians, everybody really had that. That was in part imported by the sort of in Hellas, in Hellenistic warfare in the 3rd century BC, by both Celtic and Italic soldiers, is again a proof of how homogeneous, really, especially Western European warfare was in that reason. There were different sizes of also turret, also in oval forms. Actually, the Greeks always had oval shields for skirmishes, just you don't get that sponsor more than much. But in later antiquity, if anything, the round shield is fitting as there is more body armor for the picked troops, such as the comitatenses in certain cases, even though they had themselves their own arms and armor segmentation based on the internal structure of the units that we unfortunately have no clear also understanding of, because there is no evidence. At least we can, as always, presume that the better equipped were in the front that held the line, that were followed by in the file by the others by the degree. So these are pretty much universal things. If you just read Xenophon, you have a pretty good idea of how a unit works normally. Still, there are people who think that units changed front by turning soldiers 180 degrees. They're completely useless. Like, the guys in the bottom line cannot suddenly become the file openers, right? It's just like a completely asininely revealing, declaration of complete absence of military historical literacy, if you point that out. And so you understand that the more you try to square the circle here between all these shapes, etc., like, it doesn't succeed. It's not a thing. We get the Roman legionary much better described, documented, immortalized, depicted. We would have probably been impressed by the relative heterogeneity of the Roman army, right? But also its similarity to other armies that were still somehow homogeneous in terms of expendable individual soldier types, right? Again, probably these people all looked very similar. The Romans themselves were not particularly different, even from some medium Hellenistic infantries or, again, their Central European neighbors. Regardless, in fact, of these changes in equipment, the soldiers of the legiones remained tough, well-trained, and highly effective fighting men until the very end of the Western Roman Empire. We even know, famously enough, that a Merovingian Gaul, there were still some Roman military communities that basically were the guys who had been settled there as proper soldiers, as military colonists, and that survived into throughout the period, is revered for their military quality, serving in the Merovingian armies, like with the Roman armies before, and only gradually blending with the rest of the population, partially forgetting this military traditions, right? It's not like the Italic, the Roman background was very different in terms of war bands from what you see in the migration era, speaking of their archaic times, right? Armies, by the way, also in the tribal war fought pretty much in a similar way, the way the Imperial Roman army, the permanent professional force, really did, right? The Romans were just overall better. And in fact, there is no proof, like up to the very end of the Western Roman Empire. I made a video about the 5th century Roman army in the West, that the Roman military was fundamentally bad. It was mostly a matter of politics, who supplied this army, like up to the 60s of the 5th century. Maurice showed that Italian manpower was able to reconquer Spain, hadn't the Vandals stood in between, and even to be ready to deport the defeated Visigoths and some other parts of the empire, even after generations of settlement, right? And suggestion to the contrary that the Roman army at some point was just sort of weaker than their opponent, it doesn't show. Like, this is just not a thing that normally happens anywhere. It's not like the Romans involved themselves while peoples outside were sort of superior than them. That's not how it worked. The same barbarian invasions largely witnessed to already adequately Romanized peoples, including from a military standpoint, to basically partially substitute the same Roman army, because they were more motivated, were more warlike, and they entered these places negotiating with Roman authorities, and they constituted the army, and they, in a matter of a couple of generations, they basically merged with the rest, the wider Roman majority. So this had already been the case with lots of auxiliaries already, again, employed, as we remember before, but the Roman army over the centuries had been part of what it had meant to be a Roman at a point. I made a video explaining how the imperial cult was the precondition of the same Romano-Germanic identity for how it develops in late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages. The heavy infantry described here required naturally supplementation by lighter troops who could engage at greater distances to shield the legions from harassment by similar enemy forces, or move rapidly over challenging terrain, woods, bogs, or steep hillsides that would slow and disorder their heavier comrades. All right. A very beautiful example of this is the Battle of Mons Graupius, that it that actually existed, where the Batavian auxiliaries alone were basically able to destroy the Caledonian army single-handedly. So it's, of course, the legionaries were just behind them, but this also tells you how good these forces really were. In fact, how there wasn't even this radical difference between them and the Roman legionaries. Just the latter were part of a broader establishment that had already conquered these peoples and was giving them the chance to rise also to the same Roman level through citizenship, acquired military service, largely, especially in these earlier days. And these guys were also largely still fighting with their own weapons, right? Before Julius Caesar, such at least lighter infantry, not necessarily light infantry only, at all. Actually, the majority of auxiliaries were, there wasn't such a force like just lighter troops, unless they were specialized archers, slingers, or something like that. But say skirmishers were normally integral part of other heavier troops per se. And therefore, this lighter infantry were actually pretty numerous, right? They had also these missile complements with bows or slings themselves, not just javelins for that matter, but some of them would be less specialized, right? Say the famous Cretan archers or Rhodian slingers, Balearic slingers, etc. These were tendentially troops that it's not like they knew how just to fight particularly better, because again, as communities of shepherds tended defending their islands, etc., they were very much adequate for this sharpshooting of sort. There's a lot of debate of what was actually stronger in antiquity, whether slings or bows, right? I made some video about that. The point is that the Romans would partially invest in them, giving them better equipment at some point on top of sort of their general basic qualities, so to enhance their performance in many ways. It's just like, I don't know, in Caesar's times, like the Germans are given better horses by the Romans. They weren't better cavalrymen in general, but they could be, in fact, spent in lieu of the Roman cavalrymen against the Celts, just by being given sort of better mounts compared to the German ones. In fact, were fairly scarce, and their combativeness beats Gallic quantity as well. Just for telling you also how similar they technically were, paradoxically, between one another, if that was the measure of the difference. The auxiliaries, therefore, were the reinforcements of the legions, at least in the complement of the legions. They were very numerous, equipped with light dual-purpose spears for throwing and thrusting, along with lighter javelins. So the typical soldier that we were describing before, this happened throughout Roman history. There wasn't a single moment in which the Romans used exclusively citizenry forces. And throughout most of documentable history, like the Romans actually used at least as many auxiliaries as citizens. This can easily be the case for the earlier days, because in any case, Rome arose within probably a Latin system of leagues. So you couldn't really separate like a guy who was Roman from somebody who was not a Roman. They were also all pretty similar. The same goes throughout the Polybian era with the Italics that were of the same, so to say, national stock. So when we arrive in the later empire, we say, oh, look, there were so many barbarians in the army. Had it really been different before? Look at the auxiliaries, that they had been half of the Roman army throughout all the period. So no, like there is, if anything, a moral shift. There is a political crisis, and that's what gradually brings to an osmosis, a synchrosis rather than a substitution or a like a collapse, as we've seen, of Roman military standards that are also greatly inherited by the same barbarian governments that take over, especially the West. Right, that remains also a strongly civilized area. In fact, people tend to. I made lots of famous videos at this point on the subject. Latin Germanic Europe was, say, as Latin Germanic. You can debate the Germanic only one in Northern Europe. That yes, but say post-Roman Europe in the West was not less civilized than actually was more civilized than, say, the Balkan hinterland by the time the Slavs and the Avars were swarming in, right? We're not talking about the Anatolian hinterland. There is absolutely no doubt about this overall, right? Gaul and Italy alone led a competitive axis compared to the Eastern Roman Empire as a whole. So I covered these topics in great extent. And these auxiliaries are very interesting and not given adequate attention, in my opinion. By the early 1st century AD, they were organized into auxiliary cohorts, infantry units of nominally 480 or 800 men, quingenaria or miliaria respectively, and drilled to the same high standards in the legions. These non-citizen troops, often recruited from provinces like Gaul, Spain, or Thrace, that had historically been quite warlike, in fact put up an important resistance to the Romans, provided specialized skills and received citizenship upon honorable discharge, with units sometimes expanded to miliary size, so around 800 infantry modeled on the first cohort of legions. We'll talk about this because there are some approximations here making things simple, but as you know, I take great care of everything in dedicated videos. In fact, it's being suggested, essentially, many cases, the aforementioned miliary-sized auxiliary units featured 5 double-strength sentries and occupied double the camp space. Similar units continued to the end of the empire, with many achieving elite status on a par with the best legions, as a matter of fact. We really discussed this in many videos. If you look at the Notitia Dignitatum, you will find plenty of think about the Auxilia Palatina. These were crack forces, as a matter of fact. They saved even the legionary lines, as we've seen in the Battle of Argentoratum, for example. These troops, again, could be employed in many different ways. They could be equipped in many different ways, for which I don't really see a tendency towards, for example, like abandonment of body armor. It's true that in the late antique period in general, material availability starts being really in much want, right? And it is true that the rank and file trooper likely it's debatably at least lighter than, at least if we are habituated to the notion that the average rank and file Roman legionary had been heavily armored, right? But probably there wasn't even this huge difference. The greater difference is that arms and armor tend to be concentrated just in some picked units, as opposed to before, which was more evenly spread. The regular auxiliary cohorts and later auxilia, so however they were called later, were occasionally strengthened by irregular units that fought in traditional, but we're talking infantry only here, now we'll pass to cavalry, in traditional barbarian style, though these two tended to become regularized over time. In fact, you don't find practically at any time in Roman history like units that are serving in the Roman army and do not become in some way part of the empire. Many also were discharged, they came back into the Barbaricum and kept living there. It was not really much of an issue because, as we explained, actually the control of Rome stretched even in late antiquity like far beyond the frontiers, and we tend probably to misunderstand this aspect. The barbarians would go really great lengths to satisfy the Romans in order to be co-opted, to gain land, etc. And it's only when sort of the Romans waver and give way that the barbarians push, and still to basically remain connected with Rome. I've seen it in many different videos. And as we were saying before, in some periods, actually throughout the same, the legions themselves included detachments of light infantry for closer support than auxiliaries could provide. During the later empire, both legions and the auxilium appear to have included some of their own men trained as archers to augment the specialist archer units that still existed. In part, this had happened in the legions because, as we explained before, many Romans that were not the subject, so that had become Roman as being part of subject peoples and just having impoverished themselves during during the tempera of the time were now to be armed as just archers at some point. And so it's not much this exceptional dynamic. It's really understandable if you look at the social fabric behind the military at this point. It would be interesting to compare this with other peoples, also other factors. I mean, the idea is that during the migration era, there were more horse archers around to begin with. So the idea of having more foot archers, for example, than before seemed more relevant. But if you had looked at the earlier period, not just there were lots of auxiliary archers, but probably also within the legions, there were archers on a regular basis. Cavalry support proved equally necessary, since infantry skirmishers could not safely sally forward, for example, against distant horse archers without risking being ridden down in a charge. And again, the idea that the Parthian horseman, once he performed his famous backward shot, would be unreachable is a myth, not just because there were other Parthian soldiers in the Roman ranks, but because also allegedly kind of conceptually heavier cavalry can actually reach lighter cavalry. It's not the best option, but we know it pretty well. This happened also in other parts of the world, and it has to do with combativeness as well, with experience. It seems that the heavier Celtiberian horsemen that were hired by the various Numidian kings at some point did chase, pursue, reach, and slaughter the same nimble, sort of light Berber skirmishers, right? The ejaculatores. And so this is really an interesting perspective that gets often misunderstood. Also because the bigger the battle, actually, the more difficult to get the hell out of the way it is as a broader formation. And even if that happens, it's in fact not a good thing. You have to come back at some point, that you have to realign it. It's a mess. Like by that point, your center, your heavies may have in fact been surrounded and worn out and taken enough losses. So these things happen all the time. You immediately see how needed all kind of troops really are in this picture. So the Romans could have not been otherwise, nor their enemies. Although the legion did maintain a small cavalry element of its own, as we were talking about before, the majority of mounted troops always came from elsewhere throughout this period. This is true, tendentially starting from 150 BC until, but especially also in late antiquity, this was fundamentally true. Perhaps I also made a video about late Roman light cavalry. Obviously, you could find them really everywhere, but for them to be really good, especially as soldiers, well, there was so much steppe troops around that it would have been silly not to get those. Also because if you really need just the skirmishers, those are cheap. They're not so dangerous at all in any meaningful strategic sense, even to hire, to settle somewhere. And they will mostly also maintain a lifestyle in the frontier that, say, on the Danube, close to the steppes, that will secure, this was normal, settling these barbarians in also these barely inhabited places where they could have lived themselves only. These are not the Germans that will want some sort of more sedentary abode with some infrastructure, whatever. Like, if you settle some Huns, it's going to look very differently. But in this sense, they can in fact act as a buffer against similar enemies. And this had in fact historically happened also with the Germans, etc. In Julius Caesar's time, cavalry was almost entirely regular. We have this understanding that really throughout the 2nd century BC, the Roman citizen and allied cavalry had radically shrank. Also because it cost a lot. Probably there were some social reasons behind that, where the Romans also integrated and eventually extended citizenship to the Italians, including actually the Cisalpine Gauls in the north that remained, however, somehow more militarized. In fact, Julius Caesar's legionaries were largely coming from there as a mix, essentially, of Italic colonists and sort of local Cisalpine women back in the day. So you have lots of cavalry from elsewhere. And this again shows you the confidence of the Romans. It's not just the number of auxiliaries, mostly the footmen, but also the type. Like cavalry was more technical, more sort of specific as a type of unit, and that the Romans entrust to their auxiliaries because they're so sure that they're simply going to obey. This was the case for Gauls, Germans, Spaniards. I also made a video about the German knights, right? The imperial bodyguards together with the Praetorians. We're telling you also how greatly important they were. We made a video about the Marcomanni, and we've seen how Maribod and Arminius had been raised in Rome themselves. They had this habitual connection with Roman cooptation means. And so their units too fought with greater military insight. We were talking about the Marcomanni were much more of a drilled host. They had more cavalry than the average German for different reasons, also other people's influences, but mostly also because they had resources, and this had been formed, like partially invested probably to imitate the Roman army, which is absolutely unsurprising. That was the military standard. Augustus formalized these cavalry units into the auxiliary ally, cavalry wings, quingenarii of about 480, 512 men, or miliarii of 720, 768, divided into turmi of 30, 32 horsemen, each under decurions, right? The turma, as we said before, was basically because the Romans in the legions did not have ally per se. They had this turmi of few hundred men in total. So they were smaller than the ally, or normally. Then surely there may have been an overlap at some point, but in general, this was the course. That supportive cavalry was just mostly for some minimal sort of antemne screening, scouting, but most of it was done functionally as in the Roman army by the auxiliaries. These cavalry units were in fact mainly armed with light spears and javelins, protected by mail helmets and shields. They had also sort of bulkier spears, obviously for heavier hand-to-hand combat. These troops were sometimes still supplemented by regulars such as Moorish javelinmen, Asiatic horse archers, or other unarmored skirmishers of sort. Right? These were the wildest, but sort of the best at that kind of job. They were cheaper, and they would recur historically. The Numidians, later the Maurians. The later empire saw a major expansion of cavalry, incorporating regular light skirmishers as well as cataphract lancers with both horse and rider heavily armored. This, again, because of the exposure towards the east, so there is this combined armed tactics that the Romans end up especially to acquire because of fights with the Sarmatians, with the Persians. This is completely normal. War is a hybrid. Also, those people are learning a lot from the Romans, fighting themselves, part in the Roman army. Albeit, we should say that the Roman experiments with cataphracts were always ruinous. They don't seem to have particularly performed, even though the fact that they had them and they fought also in the West obviously shows not just that they were a universal type of troop, but that in any case they served some purpose. Just in the major battles, for example, the aforementioned one of Argenturatum, they underperformed. They were not as good as the feudal and steppe cultures that normally produced them in the eastern part of the empire. In fact, that's mostly where these troops would end up being concentrated, just out of sheer use. And towards the end of the period, large amounts of barbarian regulars were once again hired. The use of bows spread rapidly among cavalry. There is a lot of this explained in the Strategikon. In the video about how underrated Roman cavalry is, I actually talked about this gradual development. But again, it was completely normal. You have a normal syncresis, right? War is the greater hybridizer, let's say, of cultures as well as its potential destroyer. So the Romans knew something about this as well, considering like the fact that they wiped out large amounts of opponents, but also got help from many of them as well. And so this is the purest development of military culture you can see, sort of in historical times and under a great deal of point of view, especially considering that resources were constantly balanced. That wasn't, as we were saying before, an infinite way to simply fund the military and sort of build the army that you wanted. This explains to you how armies, in fact, largely developed by themselves, adapting to the circumstances. And there was some subtle involvement, definitely, from a doctrinal, to use an anachronistic term, point of view. But more than else, like, it all followed a gradual development. Not a natural development. It's sort of dangerous to use biological metaphors for armies, but still something of the kind. Finally, artillery provided further support through stone throwing and bolt shooting engines. Think about the ballistae, the onagri, the scorpions. Actually, there was just like this different. The ballistae included different type of weapons. We tend to sort of separate them from the scorpions, for example. This is not so important. I made some videos already on this. Artillery was mostly confined to siege warfare. All right, they were used in open field. We have different instances of this. It was completely normal, but their primary purpose was siege warfare. Like, hadn't that existed, sort of in an impossible world, they would have invested in other types of troops, not in catapults. All right, this is at least sort of the broader insight. In fact, primarily intended for sieges, these weapons were often taken into the field during the first half of the period. At least in the sources we get this. But telling the truth, for later times, you even have the Cairo ballistae, for example, that are literally ballistas mounted on chariots. You have some technological stimulus in the later period. I'm preparing some videos about early medieval sort of Byzantine artillery, for example. The material poverty is really striking compared to antiquity in that specific period, at least. But in fact, had we seen this in the ancient eras as well, probably would have seen like smaller artillery brought together with the army and regularly employed also in open field, not differently from what happened also in the Middle Ages, also the more advanced Middle Ages. Artillery formed an integral part of the legion, by the way, until the 4th century, apparently, probably also later. And it's just like from that point onwards, there are just smaller pieces around compared to before. They retained its status when later grouped into larger formations. However, so there is probably a reorganization, refunctionalization, because indeed at that point it's better to concentrate, to allocate, to rationalize the usage properly of this or that artillery. It becomes ever more expensive. I made a video about the onagri of the later Roman army, and you understand how everything was costing more. You have small numbers of elephants, occasionally proposed as late as the 1st century AD. You had very interesting sort of Hellenistic era kind of idea of legacy shows, especially in the imperial part. They rarely appeared in practice in any meaningful way because the Romans were essentially imitating some units of antiquity, including at some point they created some Spartan units, equipping them with pikes, interestingly enough. Because the Spartans actually had pikes in the later period. Few people know that the Spartans were the only Hellenic sort of polis-based armed military that successfully managed towards the end of the period of literally replicating a Macedonian phalanx on their own, which is utterly insane. Like, the Athenians would never done this. No other people out there in the Hellenic polis ever did that anymore. And it was one of my earliest videos on Schwerpunkt. But of course, at this point, they were just like, this happened at the time of Nero. It was just like a divertissement. But at the beginning of the period, when you look at Numidian allies fighting also in Spain, this had happened also during the Macedonian Wars. The Romans did employ elephants, as a matter of fact, and also from different parts of the world, Asia, Africa, etc. There were, as you know, also probably different types of elephants, different breeds. Camels were employed mainly for their advantages in desert patrolling rather than to scare horses, as it's sometimes pointed out, because the horses may have been unnerved by their smell. Interestingly enough, the reason why the Berbers became so proficient at camel warfare is that the Romans imported camels there in North Africa, and eventually, like, also at the end of the period, if you look at battles like the one of Mammes, for example, you see the Moors having a pretty advanced, sophisticated use of camels as even some living barricade, like in times of, moments of defense, so to say. It didn't help them in that battle because the Byzantines crushed them. Groups of about a dozen camels were attached to selected infantry or cavalry garrison units in arid regions. Could help for the sake of logistics. Camels can store fat to an important degree, surviving for a long road without too much, in fact, supplies to be needed to sustain them, other than water, in fact. We understand that no specialized engineer units existed. However, each legion contained craftsmen capable of constructing turf or stone forts, barracks, roads, and bridges, wet or dry, using its own resources. The legionnaires themselves were routinely trained to, as you know, to erect their own camp every night in enemy territory, at least. It was an exercise that they deeply identified with. They built roads themselves, for which they had also the precedence, like today the military has on them, because they had built them. And this was truly understood in a metaphysical sense, because these roads were sacred as well, and they connected the universe that God had given to Romans to mold it in their own image. You have, however, also some elite units like the Equites Singulares that actually were hyper-specialized in engineering. They had a great deal of background in that field as already veterans on their own, but they went through this further education in, especially, like, as you understand here, bridge buildings, fortifications, etc. And as you know, they stayed together with the emperor, and they were the finest troops in Rome. But they were, however, an elite unit, and the best of the best, something unbelievable, unspeakable. I made a video on them. And all these aspects mix, because again, they mix with the Praetorians in this case, or the German bodyguards of the emperor. So you have this sharing of military culture that happened also for other peoples within the Roman army. This is, in part, I think, an underrated aspect of the war. And one word, in fact, looking much better at in dedicated videos. So I think this is more or less a half of what I prognosticated to be covered. I think that this is fairly good, and we will continue, not tomorrow, because usually repetitions do not end well in some ways, but there is, surely we can keep this in store and just cover it at some point. So you understand, there are definitely for each point so many different things to say. There is never like an end point, because we're talking such big of a topic, really, that every single statement can be profitably debated, but we had never done it in several years of Schwerpunkt, and so I believe that what we're doing here is good, is profitable. I've seen that actually we're having lots of new subscribers, and I don't know why the algorithm woke up or something like that, but it's really on you to share, to really give this channel the dimension it deserves, because obviously I have my limits, but in general, we are here to surpass everything. And so we're both working for it. The Roman army is one of those topics that you can never actually claim to have fully or sort of comprehensively covered. Let's check how many videos I made about it. Over 100, right? It feels too few, considering the 2,800, how many videos I made. It feels too few. It feels too scarcely homogeneous, and I think we can't really do better in so many different ways. I am trying sort of my best in general to be up to date, to make as many videos as I can, sort of funneling in all the topics that deserve to be considered. But as you know, we need to cover so much on a regular basis that here we have incoming our videos coming on the Byzantines, also the earlier Roman army, but it may happen for a while. We don't hear of much of that anymore. Here I'm seeing we have some aspect of Roman Republican history, as a civilian largely. I have this is a big spoiler for those of you who have arrived till the end. So I'm looking at this, and not too much actually. I think I prepared recently, but here what it is. Yes, Roman campaigns. I prepared this in from Antonine times to more or less to the Theologian era. That's very interesting because sometimes the chronology is also counterintuitive. We have to perhaps habituate ourselves to see sort of the Roman military also across this broader period and with timelines that are not exactly what we're more habituated to think, so to say. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.